It is the morning of July 10th, 1943, and the island of Sicily is on fire. On a dusty ridge overlooking the town of Primosole, a young British infantryman named Fusilier Jefferson presses himself flat against the scorched earth. He is not thinking about strategy or history or the broader sweep of the war. He's thinking about the thing cradled in his arms, a lump of steel roughly the size and shape of a drainpipe that someone has welded to a metal tray and called a weapon. It weighs nearly 16 kilograms. It has no trigger in any conventional sense. It smells of grease and old machinery, and in approximately 40 seconds, he is going to have to fire it at a German Panzer IV tank that is grinding toward his position at a distance of less than 100 meters. The weapon is the projector, infantry, anti-tank, the Piat. To fire it, Jefferson must brace the curved steel shoulder rest against his body, hold his breath, and squeeze a simple lever mechanism with enough force to release a powerful spring. A spring so stiff that cocking it requires a soldier to lie on his back, hook his feet through the shoulder piece, and haul upward with both hands and every gram of strength he possesses. If the weapon has not been properly cocked, it simply will not fire. If the round does not seek correctly, it will not fire. If the mechanism has been jarred or jostled during the advance, there is a reasonable chance it will not fire. The German tank is now 80 meters away. Jefferson squeezes the lever. The Piat fires with a thunderclap concussion that shakes his teeth. The hollow charge bomb, roughly the size and shape of a large medicine bottle with fins, arcs through the air in a flat, low trajectory. It strikes the Panzer on its side armor and detonates. The tank stops. The crew does not get out. This is the weapon that British infantry carried from North Africa to the Rhine. This is the weapon they cursed in the mud and praised in their memoirs. This is the weapon that, by the end of the war, had destroyed more enemy armored vehicles than any other Allied infantry anti-tank system, more than the American Bazooka, more than the German Panzerfaust, at least in Allied hands. And this is the weapon that almost every soldier who ever used it described with some variation of the same phrase. Brilliant in concept, absolutely horrible in practice. The story of the Piat is the story of British military engineering under the most extreme pressure imaginable. It is the story of what happens when a nation runs out of time, out of materials, and out of acceptable options. And it is, in the end, the story of why sometimes the weapon that soldiers hate is the weapon that wins. By 1940, the British Army had a problem with tanks. Specifically, it had a problem with other people's tanks. German armoured doctrine, honed through the campaigns in Poland and France, had demonstrated with brutal clarity that a well-coordinated tank advance could overwhelm infantry defences faster than any previously imagined countermeasure could respond. The solution that existed, the Boy's anti-tank rifle, was already obsolete before Dunkirk. It fired a large caliber round at high velocity and had been effective enough against the lighter armor of earlier German vehicles. By 1941, faced with the progressively thicker plating of the Panzer III and Panzer IV, the Boys was essentially useless. Soldiers in the Western Desert reported firing it at German tanks and watching the rounds bounce harmlessly off the hull. The weapon continued to be issued because there was nothing else to issue. The alternatives were not much better. The Boys weighed around 16 kilograms loaded, had a recoil described by almost everyone who fired it as similar to being kicked in the shoulder by a horse, and required a steady firing position that was difficult to maintain under combat conditions. The sticky bomb, the number 74 grenade, was the emergency stopgap that it sounds like. A glass sphere filled with nitroglycerin coated in an adhesive compound and covered by a metal casing that the soldier removed before throwing. The theory was that the adhesive surface would stick to tank armor upon impact. The practice was that it also stuck rather effectively to uniforms, to hands, to anything it accidentally touched. It was dangerous to carry, unreliable to deploy, and required the soldier to approach to within a few meters of an armored vehicle, which was, to put it gently, not where infantry preferred to be. What was needed was something that could be carried by a single man, could defeat the armor of a medium tank at a combat-relevant range, could be fired from a prone or kneeling position, and could be manufactured quickly and cheaply from materials that were not in short supply. Aluminium was scarce. Precision optical equipment was reserved for artillery. The machine tools needed for complex rifled barrels were already working at capacity. The solution, if there was to be one, had to use something else. The American Bazooka, which would arrive in British hands through Lend-Lease, used a rocket propellant fired electrically from a tube. It worked, and it had genuine advantages, particularly in terms of the recoil, or rather the lack of it. But it was not without problems. The rocket exhaust produced a significant backblast that made firing from enclosed positions dangerous. The round's velocity was relatively low, and in wet conditions the electrical ignition was not always reliable. In the specific conditions of northwest Europe, confined fields, flooded ditches, drizzle, the bazooka had meaningful limitations. The British War Office knew by the middle of 1941 that it needed something better. What it got was the Piat, and it got it from one of the more unconventional engineering minds to serve British arms in the Second World War. Lieutenant Colonel Latham Valentine Stuart Blacker was many things. He was a former Indian Army officer. He was an inventor of idiosyncratic enthusiasms. He had already, earlier in the war, produced a weapon called the Blacker Bombard, a spigot mortar that fired an oversized bomb from a fixed mounting and had been deployed as part of the Home Guard's last-ditch anti-invasion preparations. The bombard was not elegant, but it worked on a principle that Blacker believed could be scaled down and made portable, and that principle was the spigot. A conventional mortar works by dropping a bomb down a tube where it strikes a firing pin and ignites a propellant charge that sends it skyward. A spigot mortar inverts this arrangement. There is no tube. Instead, there is a rod, the spigot, around which the hollow tail of the bomb fits. When fired, the spigot strikes the propellant at the base of the bomb's tail and drives it forward. This means that there is no barrel in the conventional sense, no rifling, no complex machining required for the tube itself. The mechanism is, in its essential form, brutally simple. Blacker brought this concept to the design team at the Ministry of Supply, where it was refined and developed by engineers at the Directorate of Artillery and eventually produced, primarily by ICY, and a range of subcontractors at facilities across Britain. The Piat that emerged from this process was 99 centimeters long, weighed 14.5 kilograms unloaded, and could be carried and operated by a single infantry soldier, though in practice, most units assigned a two-man team, one to fire, one to carry ammunition, and assist with cocking. The bomb itself was the key innovation. Rather than relying on kinetic energy, on punching through armor with sheer velocity, as the boy's anti-tank rifle had attempted, the Piat used a shaped charge warhead based on the Monroe effect, sometimes called the hollow charge or heat principle. The warhead contained a cone-shaped cavity lined with copper. When the explosive detonated, this cavity collapsed inward at extraordinary speed, forming a jet of superplastic copper, moving at roughly 8 kilometers per second. This jet, not the explosion itself, was what defeated armor. It did not blow through the steel so much as flow through it, punching a narrow, penetrating channel and spraying lethal fragments into the interior of the vehicle. The effect on a tank crew was catastrophic. The Piat's bomb was approximately 83 millimeters in diameter at its widest point, had a total weight of around 1.36 kilograms, and could penetrate roughly 75 to 100 millimeters of armor plate, enough to defeat the frontal armor of a Panzer IV or the side armor of a Panther at ranges up to approximately 100 meters. At maximum effective range, which the official manual listed as 115 meters, penetration became less reliable. Against the frontal armor of a Tiger I at any range, the Piat was not guaranteed to achieve penetration, though strikes to the tracks, engine deck, or rear armor remained dangerous. The spigot mechanism meant that the weapon had no backblast. Unlike the bazooka, it could be fired from inside a building, through a window, from a trench, from positions where a rocket exhaust would have been lethal to the firer. This was not a trivial advantage. In the street fighting of Ortona, Arnhem, and the Reichswald, it proved decisive. Production figures remain partially classified, but estimates suggest that somewhere between 100 and 115,000 Piats were manufactured during the war, with the majority produced between 1943 and 1945. Each one left the factory essentially identical, built to tight tolerances despite the deliberately simple design capable of firing both the standard anti-tank bomb and, with a simple adjustment, a larger anti-personnel round used for clearing buildings and fixed positions. The Piat entered operational service in North Africa in early 1943, arriving with the 1st Army in Tunisia and with the 8th Army as it pushed westward following El Alamein. Its first major test came not in the open desert, where ranges were too great for it to be truly effective, but in the close terrain of the Tunisian hills, where German armor was channeled into predictable routes and infantry ambushes became viable. Soldiers who used it in those early months recorded their impressions with a consistency that is almost striking in its uniformity. The weapon was difficult to cock. On cold mornings, the mainspring, which exerted a force of roughly 90 kilograms when fully compressed, was stiff enough that even large, fit men struggled to complete the cocking procedure without assistance. In wet conditions, the mechanism required careful maintenance to prevent the striker from failing to engage. The concussion of firing was severe enough that soldiers who fired more than a handful of rounds in quick succession sometimes reported temporary hearing loss and disorientation. And yet, in Sicily, in Italy, in Normandy, and beyond, soldiers used it. They used it because when it worked with a lethality that nothing else in the infantry section could match. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The Victoria Cross was awarded for Piat actions no fewer than 6 times during the Second World War. Fusilier Francis Jefferson, the soldier whose story opened this account, was one recipient for his action in Sicily. Sergeant Major John Kennelly was another, for an action near Steamroller Farm in Tunisia. Private Ernest Alvia Smith received the cross in Italy near the Savio River for a close-quarters engagement in which he stood in the open on a road and engaged multiple German armored vehicles at a range of around 30 meters, continuing to fire and reload while under intense fire, 30 meters. With a weapon that weighed nearly 15 kilograms, that required full-body effort to cock, that produced a concussion severe enough to shake vision. The records of Piat actions in Arnhem in September 1944 are particularly detailed, partly because the battle itself generated a substantial documentary record, and partly because the weapon's performance in urban combat was so marked. In the fighting around the Arnhem Bridge and in the streets of Oosterbeek, Piat teams engaged German tanks and half-tracks at ranges measured sometimes in single-digit meters, firing through walls, from cellars, from the upper floors of burning buildings. Major Robert Kane, commanding a company of the South Staffordshire Regiment, personally fired the Piat so extensively over 9 days of fighting that the accumulated concussions caused facial hemorrhaging. He continued firing. He received the Victoria Cross. It is worth placing the Piat in direct comparison with its contemporaries because the numbers tell a story that surprised many analysts writing in the decades after the war. The American M1 Bazooka, which entered service in 1942, fired a 60mm rocket with a shaped charge warhead capable of penetrating around 75mm of armor, roughly comparable to the Piat, though later variants improved on this. Its effective range against moving targets was somewhat greater than the Piat's, perhaps 135 to 150 meters in optimal conditions. It weighed approximately 5.7 kilograms, making it considerably lighter and easier to carry. Its back blast, the rocket exhaust expelled rearward upon firing, made it dangerous to fire from enclosed spaces, and in wet conditions the electrical ignition system was a persistent source of malfunction complaints. The German Panzerfaust, literally armor fist, was the disposable single-shot weapon that became ubiquitous in German infantry use from 1943 onward. It was extraordinarily cheap to produce, could penetrate over 140 millimeters of armor in its later variants, and required almost no training to fire. It was also single-use, accurate only to around 30 meters in its early forms, and produced such a severe backblast that it could not be safely fired from a trench. German engineers produced multiple variants, each progressively more powerful. The Panzerschreck, essentially a copy of the bazooka enlarged to 88 millimeters, was more powerful than either, but heavy, expensive, and vulnerable to the same weather-related ignition problems as the American original. The Piat's lack of backblast gave it a tactical flexibility that neither German system could match in confined terrain. Its shaped charge warhead was equivalent to or better than the early bazooka against the armor it was actually likely to encounter, and its double function, anti-tank and anti-personnel, meant that a section carrying 3 or 4 Piat rounds had genuine utility in multiple scenarios, rather than a single specialized one. The German army, it is worth noting, captured Piats in sufficient quantities during the Italian campaign to study them carefully. Several German technical assessments from 1943 and 1944 described the weapon's performance with something approaching admiration, specifically noting the spigot mechanism as an elegant solution to the barrel manufacturing problem. There is no evidence that Germany produced a direct copy, but the principle of spigot-launched hollow-charge weapons continued to interest German ordnance engineers until the end of the war. The actual impact of the Piat on the course of the war is difficult to quantify precisely, partly because vehicle kill attribution in combat is genuinely difficult. Multiple weapon systems frequently engaged the same target, and partly because British Army records of vehicle kills by weapon type were not consistently maintained across all theatres. What the available records show is significant enough. Post-war analysis by the British Army Operational Research Group, drawing on records from Italy and Northwest Europe, estimated that Piat fire accounted for somewhere between 7 and 17% of all German armored vehicle kills attributed to infantry action, a range that reflects the difficulty of precise attribution rather than any fundamental uncertainty about the weapon's effectiveness. In Italy specifically, where terrain consistently forced German armor into close contact with infantry, Piat kills were proportionally higher. The psychological impact is harder to measure, but should not be dismissed. German tank commanders operating in Italy and northwest Europe knew by 1944 that infantry positions were not safe to approach carelessly. The knowledge that a man in a ditch or a cellar might be holding a weapon capable of destroying their vehicle at a range of 30 meters changed the tactical calculus in ways that went beyond simple vehicle loss statistics. German after-action reports from Normandy describe an increased reluctance among tank crews to operate without infantry support in close terrain. A reluctance that had meaningful consequences for the effectiveness of armored counterattacks. The Piat also influenced post-war anti-tank weapon development in ways that are often underappreciated. The spigot mortar principle, using the bomb's own propellant to drive it off a fixed rod, informed several later designs, including elements of the British Law 80 program studied in the 1950s. The hollow charge warhead technology, refined through Piat production and use, fed directly into post-war shaped charge research at the Royal Armament Research and Development Establishment. The Piat itself was withdrawn from British service in the early 1950s, replaced by the American M20 Super Bazooka and subsequently by more advanced systems. But the engineering solutions it embodied did not disappear with it. Surviving Piats can be examined today at the Imperial War Museum in London, the Tank Museum at Bovington in Dorset, and at several regimental museums across the United Kingdom. Handling one, if the curators are feeling particularly generous with accredited researchers, confirms everything that every soldier who used it said. It is heavy. The spring mechanism is stiff even after 80 years. The shoulder rest digs into the collarbone in a way that suggests whoever designed it had never actually tried firing it, and it is immediately, unmistakably clear that this is a weapon built not for comfort, but for a single purpose, executed with utter conviction. Return, then, to that Sicilian hillside, to Fusilier Jefferson lying in the dust with his ears ringing and a German tank stopped on the road below him. The Panzer IV is not moving. The crew, if they survive at all, will not be fighting today. Jefferson's Piat has done what it was built to do. Not elegantly, not comfortably, not without requiring him to perform something approaching a feat of athletic endurance simply to prepare it for use. But it has done it. There is something almost poetic in the PIAT's particular brand of effectiveness. It was never loved, it was rarely praised in the field without qualification. Memoirs written by veterans of the campaigns in Italy and northwest Europe describe it with a kind of grudging respect that is unique among weapons of the period, not the affection soldiers sometimes felt for a reliable rifle or a well-balanced knife, but a harder, more complicated acknowledgement. This thing worked, in spite of everything. In spite of the spring and the weight and the concussion and the cold mornings and the wet and the nerve required to hold your position while a tank closed to 90 meters, to 80, to 60, and wait for the moment when you could not possibly miss. In the mathematics of war, what matters is not how much a weapon is liked. What matters is whether it does what it is supposed to do when it is supposed to do it, under the conditions that actually exist rather than the conditions that were hoped for. The PIAT met this test, not on a firing range in Surrey where conditions were optimal, not in a technical manual where performance figures could be expressed in clean decimal notation, but in the streets of Ortona where the buildings were on fire. At the Arnhem Bridge, where Major Kane's face was bleeding and the ammunition was running low. On a Sicilian hillside where a young man with ringing ears lay in the dust and looked at a stopped tank. The Piat was, by any reasonable measure, an awkward, demanding, physically punishing weapon. It was also, by the same measure, one of the most effective infantry anti-tank systems of the entire war. It was built in a hurry, from a principle that most ordnance engineers would have called eccentric at a moment when Britain could not afford to wait for something better. 6 Victoria Crosses, over 100,000 weapons produced, tanks destroyed from Sicily to the Rhine. Soldiers hated it, and they kept firing it anyway. That is not a contradiction. In the particular arithmetic of the Second World War, that is perhaps the highest compliment a weapon can receive.